let's go ahead and move on. Slightly more hopeful story from my perspective. Let's go ahead and put this up there on the screen, which is that San Francisco has been in the midst of a major recall around election for 3 members of the school board. And on Tuesday, San Francisco voters overwhelmingly supported the ouster of 3 of these members. It's the first recall election in nearly 40 years. So specifically on the recall itself, I spent a lot of time reading about this. Part of the problem, Krystal, is that a lot of this stuff gets culture warified into the right and left-wing media, and that's specifically why I tried to read it all through the lens of California-based local at both LA Times and San Francisco. So here's what happened. About a quarter of the people in San Francisco ended up coming out to vote. The major issue at hand had nothing to do with critical race theory. It had to happen with this, that these 3 school members in particular, number 1, had antagonized the Asian American community by removing the standards test-based system in order to enter the most prestigious high school in San Francisco, which has to do with test scores and, their assumptions of equity and how apparently that's a much better system to have a lottery one. But the second one was this: furor and outrage over the fact that San Francisco schools were closed longer than some of the most in the country, and that in the midst of that these 3 members in particular sought to have a campaign to rename 1/3 of the schools in San Francisco, including a school named for Abraham Lincoln.
Yes.
Look, one of them was Dianne Feinstein. That I actually think is kind of funny. I can't stand Dianne Feinstein.
Oh, they were going to rename a school named after Dianne Feinstein?
That's kind of hilarious.
I support that.
Yeah, I also support that for different reasons.
I'm now opposed to the recall.
Right. Not woke reasons. It came down to this. Were these people normal citizens, overwhelmingly Democratic in nature, many of them Asian Americans? This was a huge show out from the Asian Americans who came out and said, you are focused on non-critical BS, like renaming schools, while my kid has a mask strapped to his face or cannot go to school and has to do Zoom. And that is ultimately what this was all about. So there's a lot of culture war analysis of this. I frankly think it just comes down to, wokeism is certainly part of it, giving the whole school renaming. It was COVID insanity. I think that's, at the end of the day, that is why there was this overwhelming 70% vote in order to turn them, in order to recall this election.
And just to show you how mainstream the concerns over the actions of this school board and these 3 members in particular were, San Francisco Mayor London Breed.
Yeah, she supported the recall.
She supported the recall because of exactly the reasons that you're citing, that she felt in particular that schools were shut for way too long, that they were focused on other superfluous issues rather than doing the work to try to prepare to reopen schools. And of course, we've tracked here very closely that while it was an understandable, out of necessity and caution decision at the very beginning of the pandemic, it very quickly became clear that that policy was doing a lot more damage to kids than ultimately it was protecting them. And then you layer on top of that the issue with, I think it's called Lowell High School. I just remember because my son is also named Lowell, where they, it's a similar sort of touchy dynamic as what we've seen in New York, where there's this kind of sense from the Chinese American community in particular that they changed the metrics because there were too many Asians testing into the school. And they're like, well, this seems like bullshit. This is unfair.
It
seems
is
like
actually
bullshit.
BS.
So, so you layer those things on top of one another, and what you get is a picture of, it's the big problem for the Democratic Party writ large, something I'm talking about in my monologue. Like, you're focused on all this symbolic cultural nonsense that doesn't impact people's daily lives. And on the issues that are at the core of people's concerns, healthcare, education, economics, you're out to lunch. You're not doing anything. Or in this instance, you're actively harming us. It's not just that you're absent. You're actively harming us and our children and their ability to learn in a classroom. I mean, I can tell you as a parent, the year and a little bit that my kids were on remote learning, it was a lost year.
Yeah.
And my kids are extraordinarily, lucky and privileged in a million years. And they're kids who do well at school and, don't have issues learning. But my son, when he was 7 and he's trying to do 6 and 7, he's trying to do remote learning. That was impossible. So I feel for these parents, and I completely understand why they turned down and why there was such a lopsided margin in favor of removing these people. I also have to throw in, this was also from the local coverage, the Board of Supervisors president who was backing the school board members, so they were against the recall. This is how they explained what was going on, and very much trying to paint it like this wasn't a local grassroots movement, that this was outside forces and all of this. So the Board of Supervisors president says, Trump's election and bold prejudice brought a lot of that out. Even in our Democratic and liberal city, there are a lot of people who do not want people of color making decisions in leadership, even though the voters said that is what they want. The 3 individuals who were recalled happened to be people of color. Oh, by the way, so are 6 out of 7 of the members of the school board. So to paint this as
racism,
just trying to paint it as some like, oh, it's Trump's fault and it's racism. Like, this is why you all deserve to lose. I mean, look, I've said it a million times, Republicans don't deserve to win, but if this is what your approach is going to be, you 100% deserve to lose.
I also forgot to mention this one. Like, Allison Collins, who was one of the 3 ousted board members, had actually said in the past that Asian Americans are like slaves who benefit from working inside the slave owner's house. So basically calling us all Uncle Toms, who are doing well inside the system and not bucking it, not standing in solidarity. So Allison, screw you, burn in hell. I don't really know what else to say, because when you see crying racism at San Francisco voters, probably some of the most progressive people on the planet, or at least in the United States, and calling them racist for wanting their kids to go back to school. That's the ultimate state of this. But what actually also bothers me is, it just shows you the essentialism that comes down to so much of our politics, and which is so depressing. We are fighting these titanic battles, masks in school or not. Some race book, which, by the way, I completely oppose, in school or not. We're not having fights about funding, better curricula. Should we, sports funding, after school program, actually helping some of these kids, increasing math and science, pathways to apprenticeships, all that is off the table. It's a binary choice, masks in school or not school better or not, or school better this way or school better this way. That's the most depressing part.
And that's a real regression, because before the pandemic, we were having that conversation.
Yes,
I mean, that's what the Red for Ed, the teacher strikes, that's what they were all about. I mean, there were local issues about like teacher pensions, but what that really boiled down to, and why you saw it, those protests sweeping across a lot of different red states, is because those are the states that had cut education funding and cut education funding and cut education funding. So they were pulling, schools where they didn't have enough resources to even have a 5-day school week
or
anymore.
Like teachers buying, supplies on their
which is routine. I mean, we showed you that the teachers scrambling for cash at the hockey game. I think I was in North or South Dakota. I remember the images coming out of textbooks that were from like 30 years ago and are totally worn down. I mean, that conversation was really essential and really critical. And now that's lost in, what are effectively culture war fights. There's one other piece of this California story that is relevant, which is, this is astonishing, shows you what a bad place Democrats are in right now. Joe Biden, let's put these numbers up on the screen. Joe Biden is actually underwater in California. Now it's narrow. 47% approve.
That takes skill.
48% disapprove. Look at the numbers for Kamala. This is her home state. 38% approve and 46% disapprove. Okay, guys? Democrats have lost California. Now, that doesn't mean, obviously, as we saw with Gavin Newsom, that they're ready to vote for Republicans. But this is how great the failures are and how disgusted people are with the total lack of action and care and concern for what their actual day-to-day concerns are, that even in California, Biden is underwater. And again, you notice, keep these numbers up for a second longer, you notice another trend that we've been tracking from the very beginning. He only has 17% that approve strongly, and meanwhile, he has 34% who disapprove strongly. Similar with Kamala. She has only 15% that approve strongly and 35% who disapprove strongly. So even for Biden, when you have it roughly 50-50 here, the number of people who love him are dwarfed by the number of people who absolutely hate him. It was the polar opposite. With Trump, it was just completely polarized and divided. You had a lot of people who loved him and a lot of people who hated him. Biden does not have that core enthusiastic support, even in a state like California.
Yeah, look, these numbers, it just shows you the ultimate state. They're complete paper tigers. They're the luckiest people on earth and somehow got into the Oval Office, but reality is coming in quick. And look, I resisted the Jimmy Carter label for a long time, but I continue to see a lot of parallels. And at that time, there was one former governor of California who came out and who showed you what the next political revolution was going to be. So
I don't think it's going to be Gavin Newsom who's coming to our rescue, though, this time, guys.
Probably not. I don't think it's going to be Ron DeSantis either. Perhaps that person is out there.
I mean, you have to think he's going to get a primary. Like, these numbers are just way too weak for them not to smell blood in the water for somebody to jump in.
Right? I mean, it's a one-party state. They've got that fake primary thing.
Oh, I'm not talking about California. I'm talking about primary. Biden in general.
Yeah, look, I hope so. We'll see. The regime is strong, even though it is weak.
Maybe the regime is strong. We're going to find out. Hey guys, thanks so much for watching.
That's right. Just as a reminder, you can become a premium subscriber today. Watch the full show completely uncut, our reactions to each other's monologues. You get to listen to it. You get to ask us questions, all that good stuff. Link is right there in the description or at breakingpoints.com.
Best of all, great way to say screw you to the mainstream media.